All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Richmond Public Library Presents Young Writers Workshop. I'm Mr. Lewis from the Ginter Park Library. Today, we're going to be talking about dialogue, the conversations that your characters have in your story. We're going to talk about today our general grammar tips, and there's a lot of them, so buckle up for that one. We're going to talk about the quirky quotation marks, when to use them, how to use them, proper punctuation, and this is a big one because there's a lot that goes into it, convincing speech, avoiding complexity, and go over some common mistakes. All right, there's a lot to get into, so let's get started. So let's talk about grammar. It's a big topic, but let's get started with quotation marks. This is double quotes versus single quotes. All right, if you look at the quotation mark, there's two kinds. Double quotes have the two little hashes, and single quotes have just the one. And we use both of them in dialogue for different purposes. Double quotes are for direct speech. This person said, in double quotes is whatever the actual spoken word is. All right. Single quotes are for repeated speech. They are for quotes within quotes. So if a person is repeating something that they read or heard from another person, or even from like a sign or something they read, then that repeated quote would be in single quotes. So you would not have, if you have a spoken word within spoken word, you don't have double quotes for both. All right, that might sound a little confusing, but I'll have an example on the following page just to kind of show you. But just remember, double quotes are the standard for anything that is direct speech from a character. Single quotation marks are for repeated speech within a larger speech. Okay. Next, let's talk about punctuation and dialogue. This is a big one. Commas separate spoken words from the speaking verbs. Speaking verbs are said, whispered, declared, shouted, whatever. The action of actually saying those words, that's the speaking verb. Okay, so whenever we had this character said, comma, and then the actual thing that they said. All right, so commas separate spoken words from speaking verbs. We also use commas to interrupt dialogue in quotation marks when we insert speaking verbs. That might sound a little confusing, but really it's very simple. If you have a single sentence or a couple of sentences of dialogue, of quoted actual speech, you can break that up in the middle, anywhere you want really, but it should make sense logically, with comma, this character said, or whatever, comma, continue the direct quote. All right, again, I'll have an example on the next page. The first word of a spoken sentence is capitalized, even when it follows a comma. This is actually really important because it can be confusing. This character said, comma, double quote, what's for lunch? All right, the W is capitalized, even though it's not following a period. The direct quote, the actual spoken sentence, is a separate sentence. Therefore, it has a capital letter at the start. All right, what's for lunch? That W will be capitalized because it's the start of a sentence, even though it's following a comma. Okay? And then periods separate spoken words from actions. Sometimes you can write a spoken sentence or just any kind of speech and follow it with an action that might seem related to the speech, but it's not an actual speaking verb. Okay, it's not said, whispered, shouted, whatever. All right. In that case, you separate the spoken word, you separate the dialogue in the quotes from the action with a period, not a comma. All right, so actions are separated with periods, speaking verbs are separated with commas. Okay, so let's get into some examples. So for our first example, let's go with something simple. I said, we couldn't find the cheese. All right, here you see the punctuation. I said, speaking verb, comma, capital W, we couldn't find the cheese, period. All right, double quotes to show that it is the person talking, in this case I, all right, comma, separating the speaking verb from the spoken actual words. Next is, listen, comma, she said, comma, can you hear that? Question mark. All right, this is an example of breaking up dialogue with a speaking verb in the middle. All right, notice that listen is followed by a comma and said is followed by a comma. Now, here's something interesting. Notice that the C in can is not capitalized because it's a continuation of the sentence. The entire sentence being spoken is, listen, can you hear that? Right? So that is a single sentence. All right? So the C in can does not need to be capitalized in that case because it's not a new sentence. Right? So you break up a sentence with the commas. All right? And Here's an example just on the other side. I have no idea, comma, he said, confused. All right. So even though we end the spoken sentence, I have no idea, there's no more after that, we don't end that with a period, we end it with a comma because the overall sentence is still continuing. All right. So the period in this sentence would be after confused, not after idea. All right. So commas always separate sentences from speaking verbs in this sense. Okay. Let me explain again. Period. She turned to the board. All right. Let me explain again is a spoken word, but turned is not a speaking verb. It's an action. It's what the person speaking is doing. All right. So even though it's on one line and you kind of think of it as a single like action, she's talking as she's turning to the board, the spoken word is separate. Therefore, it is separated with a period, not a comma, and the S in she is now capitalized because they are separate sentences. All right, we kind of treat the spoken word and the speaking verb as a single sentence or as a single kind of block, but in this case, there's two separate ones. Let me explain again. Period. End of spoken word. Right? There's no speaking verb here. She turned to the board. Now, you could said, let me explain again, comma, she said, period, she turned to the board. You could do that, but it's honestly a waste. You know who's talking. She is the one who's talking in this case because it's implied by her action following the spoken word. Okay? So I hope that makes sense. It said, handle with care. I'm sure of it, comma, I insisted. Okay? So here we see the double quotes versus single quotes. It said, handle with care. Handle with care is what the sign in this case said, and that is in single quotes. See the single hashes. All right? But the spoken words as a whole are in double quotes. Right? And it's separated by a comma with a speaking verb, in this case, insisted. Insisted in this sense is being used as a speaking verb. Therefore, we separate it from the actual spoken words with a comma. It said, in single quotes, handle with care. I'm sure of it, comma, I insisted. All right, one more. He looked at his notes, period. Our teacher said the homework is due on Friday. And here again, we see action verb separating spoken words, but no speaking verb. He looked at his notes, period, not comma, because looked is not a speaking verb, right? So, period. Our teacher said the homework is due on Friday. Now, again, our, in this case, is capitalized. The O is capitalized because it's a new sentence, all right? And again, we don't need the speaking verb because it's implied that the person speaking is the he looking at his notes. Okay, so speaking verbs are not always necessary unless you specifically need to point out who is speaking. If you have other actions that do that for you, then you can kind of skip over the spoken verb, right? In which case, you use periods to separate the verb, the action verb, from the spoken word. One other thing to note about this sentence is that the words homework is due on Friday or the homework is due on Friday is not in single quotes, right? So even though you're repeating what the teacher said, our teacher said the homework is due on Friday, even though we're repeating it, because we're not saying it word for word, we're just giving the idea of what the person said. We don't need to put it in single quotes. Single quotes are only when you repeat something word for word exactly. All right. So if you just said our teacher said the homework is due on Friday, that's not necessarily word for word what the teacher said. Okay. It's just the general idea. You're repeating what they said, but not word for word. All right. So you do have to be aware of that. When you're repeating word for word, you have to use single quotes. But if you're not, if you're just giving the general idea of it, then you can just leave the quotes out and just say, oh, they said that. All right. Hope that makes sense. So I hope this kind of clears up some of the grammar issues that we were talking about in the previous page. Okay, let's move on. Just a couple more quick points. First of all, any spoken sentences that are broken up by speaking verbs use a period. What I mean by that is if you have one long spoken section that has more than one sentence, if you break up those sentences with a speaking verb, then you have a period after the speaking verb. So here's the example. I don't know, I said. Maybe we should ask him. So there's a comma after I don't know. I don't know is a complete sentence, and it is separate from maybe we should ask him, right? But it is separated from the speaking verb, said in this case, by a comma. And then the period to show the end of the sentence comes after said. So it's I don't know, comma, I said, period, and then capital M, maybe we should ask him. Okay, so two separate sentences, I don't know, maybe we should ask him, two separate sentences, broken up by a speaking verb, I said, has a period after the speaking verb. Okay? Next up is exclamation marks and question marks. And these basically can be used just like commas to end a sentence before a speaking verb, right? If they end a sentence and there's no speaking verb following that sentence, then they just act like a period, right? It's just the end of a sentence. But if you use it before a speaking verb, then it acts like a comma. So for example, hi, she said, it's nice to meet you. So hi is in this case being used as a complete sentence, even though it's technically an exclamation and therefore its own thing. It still works the same way. You have that exclamation mark after hi, lowercase s, she said, period, because it's separate. It's nice to meet you. Okay? So the she is not capitalized, even though it's following an exclamation mark, which would think would mean it should be capitalized. Okay? So exclamation marks, question marks acts like commas in sentences that come before a speaking verb. Right? Another example, what's that smell? They asked. Okay? What's that smell? Question mark, lowercase t for they asked. Okay? So that's really about it. Just keep that in mind as you're writing these specific grammar points. If you're ever not sure, you can come back and, do a quick refresher. So now that we've covered most of the grammar issues, we're going to talk about actually writing dialogue, writing speech, all right, for your characters. And one of the most important rules is keeping it realistic, all right? Your speaking should sound natural, all right? Characters talk in a natural way. There's a flow to it, all right? And if when you're writing, it comes off as feeling very like choppy or just overall unnatural, it's going to be noticeable to the reader and it's going to affect the enjoyment of the reading process, all right? A good example of this would be contractions, all right? So don't avoid contractions. Contractions are words like can't, won't, isn't, shouldn't, all right? When you smush two words together and you have that little apostrophe at the end, that's a contraction. Everybody uses contractions all the time. It's just a part of our everyday speech. So don't avoid them when your characters talk, unless it's a character choice. All right, there are characters who sometimes purposely do not use contractions. That either shows that they're very proper in the way they speak or they're not overly familiar with the language that they're using. All right, so, but overall, characters should use contractions. All right, now, there is kind of a balancing act here, though, because when you think about the way other people talk, there are a lot of different things in them. Specifically, I'm thinking of pauses, all right? You should not include uhs and ums when you're writing character dialogue, unless you're specifically showing an awkward pause, all right? In everyday speech, in real life, people use these pauses, uhs, ums, they're pause words, to kind of reflect on what they're going to be saying next. All right, there's a natural pause in your speech while your brain kind of catches up with what you're saying and plans out what you're going to say next. All right, and everyone has them. They're not always uhs and ums. I say all right a lot. Maybe you've noticed in my videos, I say all right. That's, in a lot of ways, that's a pause word. All right, it's not just to catch you up, but it's also to catch myself up so that I know what I'm going to say next. All right, so you don't have to include uhs and ums. All right, people have natural pauses in speech, but in writing, they actually feel forced and awkward. If you ever read a dialogue in a story, you never see uhs and ums, because if you did, it would break up the flow of the story and it would feel awkward. Okay, so there's that balance that you have to find between making it sound natural, but also not 100% reflective of what real people talk like, okay? So your characters in your stories should not have those awkward pauses, because words matter, all right? That's what this all comes down to. The way your character talks, the words they choose to say matter, all right? So having those pauses, having those pause words will reflect on your character, all right? And it's important that your character uses words that fit that character. All right. And another important aspect of this is slang. All right. Word choice, including slang, need to match the setting and the character. All right. Some characters use slang all the time, some characters don't. Slang is words like cool and neat, and I'm probably showing my age here, but words that have a specific meaning, even if it's not the exact meaning, the exact definition of that word. All right. The definition of cool has to do with temperature, has nothing to do with how neat somebody finds something. All right. So slang is an important part of our culture, but if it doesn't fit the setting, it's going to draw the reader out of your story. All right. If you are writing something that takes place in medieval Europe, they're not going to use the word cool. All right. It just wasn't a thing back then. So be aware when you're writing what words your character uses, because it needs to fit the setting and it needs to fit the character. So now that we've gone over the rules, let's talk about some just general tips. And we're going to start with some general tips that I like to call keeping it simple. And we'll start with, there's nothing wrong with said. All right, a lot of times people will try to come up with different words other than said in order to break up the monotony of it, because you'll find yourself writing the word said a lot. So if you have a conversation between two people, you might end up saying said quite a few times. So sometimes people will try to break it up with different, quote unquote, more interesting versions of it. So you have words like declared and intoned, right? And you can do that if the situation calls for it, all right? But really, there's nothing wrong with the word said. It's fine. You don't have to find more ridiculously complicated and complex words to take its place, because it does its job just fine. All right. This is what we call avoiding purple prose. Purple prose is when you have overly complex words when simple words will do. You don't have to be overly complex when you're writing, and you don't need big, complicated words in order to make your story stand out or to make it seem better or more engaging. Simple is fine. All right. So stick with said. You can use words like declared or even intoned if you really wanted to, but use them sparingly. Don't do them all the time, and keep it simple. All right. Next, don't overdo expository dialogue. What I mean by that is don't have too much where one character is just talking to another character explaining everything. All right. It's a tricky thing because you have to be able to get information to the readers, and dialogue is one of the better ways of doing that, because it's not just a block of text that says, here is the information for you, the reader. All right. This way, there's a reason for the information to be given so that it feels a little more natural. But if you just have two characters talking and one character is just sitting there basically explaining everything to another character and by proxy to the reader, it's boring and it's obvious. So just be aware of that as you're doing it. All right. Also, remember, dialogue doesn't happen in an instant. Dialogue takes time. When you're speaking, it takes time to say the words, to get them across. Conversations can last for hours. They don't happen in seconds. All right? So just keep that in mind as you're writing. What are your characters doing while they're talking, okay? Because dialogue and action can take place at the same time, but keep in mind that it's hard to talk in some situations. All right? If two people are driving in a car, they can have a conversation, obviously. But the length of that conversation sometimes is dependent on the length of the car trip. All right? If it's a 5-minute car ride, then you're not going to have an hours-long conversation in that 5 minutes. Does that make sense? So just be aware of how long it should be taking your characters to have their conversation while they are having it. Okay? And just a few more general tips to kind of go on. First of all, if the dialogue that you're showing is between two people, you could just have alternating paragraphs. What I mean by that is every line, every time you go from one paragraph to the next, even if it's just like a single sentence or a single line, you always show that you're switching who's speaking by going from one line to the next, from one paragraph to the next. All right, so if you have dialogue between just two people, you can just go from one to the next, to the next, to the next, one after the other, without constantly using speaking verbs, okay? So avoid repeating said too often. I know this might sound exactly the opposite of what I just talked about, there's nothing wrong with the word said. But what I mean here is that you don't need to constantly be using speaking verbs if the dialogue is just between two people, okay? If you have alternating paragraphs and each one is a line of dialogue or a paragraph of dialogue, then it is implied that it is alternating between who is speaking at a given time. So as long as you establish at the very beginning of the conversation who is speaking in what order, and then every now and then you can throw in a said or an action just to kind of break up the constant just speech, then it's fine to just say said a couple of times. I hope that makes sense. It'd be like, instead of saying, hi, I said, hi, she said. How are you? I asked. I'm fine, she said. See, you're constantly saying those speaking verbs, and if it's just two people, then it's unnecessary. Okay? So you can just alternate the statements, the spoken words, without having to constantly repeat the speaking verbs. Okay? It's a little more difficult if you have more than two people talking at once, because then it can get confusing because it's not obvious who is talking. All right, so in that case, you generally would have to have speaking verbs with every change of who is speaking, if that makes sense. Okay? And lastly, beware of awkward speech. Awkward speech is very easy to write, but it's not always easy to identify. All right, awkward speech is awkward. All right, it's when people are talking, it's if they're choppy, if they're talking in ways that people just don't normally talk. It's awkward. All right, and there's one very easy way of identifying and fixing awkward speech, and that is read your dialogue out loud. Either even just to yourself is fine, but even better to somebody else. All right, if you want, write up a script and give it to somebody else, and if they're willing, you can have them read one portion and you read the other portion. And speaking it out loud, it'll be very obvious when something is awkward and when something sounds natural. All right, so I highly recommend when you're writing dialogue, read your dialogue out loud. Even if it's just to yourself, you will notice when your dialogue is awkward or sounds rushed or the punctuation isn't right. You will catch it if you read it out loud. All right, that's really it for dialogue. All right, I know there was a lot that kind of came at you pretty quickly, so I hope that it all made sense, and I hope you're able to use it in your writing. And I hope that this is something that you are finding very useful and that you enjoy. So remember, however you decide to write, just write. Thank you all so much for joining me in this video. I'll see you all next time.